Hi, my name is Tian Yu Shea. I'm a fourth-year medical student at the New York Institute of Technology, and you're listening to Do or Do Not. Today we have Dr. Adam Katof. Currently, Dr. Katof has a busy internal medicine practice, working with a physician assistant and is employed by a large healthcare organization. Dr. Katof practices in a small suburb of New York City and cares for thousands of patients, sometimes spanning 3 generations in one family. Dr. Katof went to the elite University of Pennsylvania for his undergraduate education, and after evaluating all his options for medical school, attended NYITCOM, where he graduated in 1999. After considering a career in radiology and gastroenterology, Dr. Katof completed his internal medicine residency at North Shore and after residency accepted a position with an established medical practice. Unhappy with his decision, he proceeded to explore every permutation of internal medicine in a quest to find personal fulfillment and work-life balance. Although Dr. Katof did not follow a straight path, he shares his journey, which we know will help future doctors with their own. We hope you enjoyed this episode.
Adam, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's my pleasure. I'm certainly a big listener of the podcast, so I'm happy to be on.
We're really excited that you're on and that you listen. So, Adam, you're an internal medicine physician in primary care. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you just give us a brief description of, say, what your Friday looked like? What did your day look like? What time did you wake up? What did you do in the morning? And what did your workday look like?
I'm sorry if you hear any dog barks in the background. My dogs are looking at me like I'm crazy doing this. Yeah, so Friday, I'm an early riser, so I typically wake up at 6 o'clock, 6:30. I set my alarm for 6:30, but usually it's not my alarm that wakes me up. I kind of wake up naturally pretty early. I like to read the newspaper. I usually read it online, and then I have breakfast and say hi to my dogs, walk the dogs, and then I go to work. So I usually get into work around 8:30. I do internal medicine that's office-based only. So I'm in the office all day from 8:30 till 5:30. And really from 8:30 on, we're just going room to room to room to room, seeing patients. There's about a 40-minute spot, usually between 12 and 1 o'clock, which is in quotes lunch. Sometimes we actually eat lunch. Sometimes, we're adding patients into that slot or making phone calls, things like that.
You're just rocking and rolling all day long, kind of going room to room and making sure everybody's taken care of.
Yep, that's the way it is, an outpatient, going room to room all day.
Now, so give me an example on Friday. Were you seeing clearances? Were you seeing sick visits? Was there a little bit of everything? Was there any patient that really stood out for you on Friday?
Yeah, every day we typically see a mix of the following. A big chunk of it is people coming for their maintenance, their follow-ups, diabetics or people with hyperlipidemia, people who come on a regular basis, whether it's every 3 or 4 months, if it's surveillance of their medications. So that probably is about 60% of the schedule. And I would say the other 40% is a mix between medical clearances, annual physicals, new patient annual physicals, and sick visits. I don't see that many sick visits because my physician assistant, Christian, who's excellent physician assistant, ends up seeing a lot of the sick visits, just the dynamics of our office. But, I usually see a few of them a day.
So now a lot of doctors complain that you rock through this day and you're finished and then you get home and you have to do charts. So when you get home, do you have to sit and type up charts, and how long does that usually take?
Yes, but it's very different for me now than it was in the past. So I'm very fortunate enough to have a scribe who's with me all day that types my notes throughout the day. Yes, I still have work to do when I get home, but it's much, much less than I used to have. So instead of really starting my notes at 7 o'clock at night the way I used to, because I'm not the type of doctor who sits there and types in front of patients. I just can't do it. In my own opinion, and I know a lot of people differ from me, but I just think it's disrespectful. I'm not a great typer. I'm more of a 2-finger typer. So I feel like to actually get anything useful into the chart, I'm looking down and typing with 2 fingers. So I always just took notes, when I didn't have a scribe, and then I would come home and I would take my notes and put them into a note. Now, with having the scribe, which is an important thing for me, I'm going through what he wrote and making some changes and then doing the billing. And I would say instead of doing 3 to 4 hours of work when I got home, now I'm doing an hour of that type of work. Of course, there's more time that's spent calling patients, refilling prescriptions that I didn't get to during the day, calling people back, and also calling people with their imaging results as well as blood work.
So just so I understand, there's a young man or woman in the room with you during the visit, and they're doing the bulk of the creation of your notes, and that decreases your workload. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. But that person had to learn, there's definitely a learning curve there. So he has to learn what I like my notes to look like, what I like them to say, the way I like them to look. And that takes some time. So the first 2 months, we spent a lot of time every day after patients going through the notes together. But thankfully, he's been with me for over a year. So now things work very smoothly.
That's great. And we're going to talk a little bit about how your practice looked in the past. I know we've talked about that before, but you mentioned that you just have an office-based practice. So does that mean that you don't go to the hospital right now? And what happens to your patients when they end up in the hospital?
Correct. I don't go to the hospital and see patients, and I'm not active in their care from a day-to-day basis. However, I'm following along with the case. Sometimes when they're admitted to hospitalists within the system that I work in, they call me, we go over the case, and they certainly at least call me at the end of the case so that, I can grab the torch and know what needs to be followed up with. So yeah, I don't see them day to day like I used to years ago, but I have good communication with the hospitalists that I use so that we have good continuity of care.
So let me ask you, we're going to shift gears a little bit. Can you tell me when you first became interested in medicine? Do you remember when you first decided you wanted to be a doctor?
Yeah, I mean, it was at a young age, and a lot of it had to do with my parents. Both of my parents are pharmacists. Well, they're now retired pharmacists. Everything in my house growing up had the name of a drug or a drug company on it. And, I was always inquisitive as to what these names were, and I would ask my parents. I think that my father always wanted to be a physician. And we never actually had this conversation, he and I. But from growing up, I got the impression that he, as a pharmacist, was very frustrated in his dealings with physicians. And particularly when it came to pharmacology, he knew a lot more than most of the physicians that he was working with. So he would get very frustrated. And I would hear about this every night growing up. So I knew that my parents wanted me to be a doctor, and I kind of followed that route without thinking much about it. And I'm not unhappy as a physician today, but I think a lot of why I became a physician was more to make my parents happy, and from living in that background and not so much making a decision that I wanted to be a physician.
Adam, I think that follows with a lot of the other people that we've interviewed on the podcast, whether they're family members that are physicians or other people that kind of felt that a physician is a noble cause. I think family was a lot of the influence behind a lot of people's decisions. So that's a common theme. So you applied to undergraduate, and I understand you went to University of Pennsylvania.
Yes, that's correct.
And when you got in, were you like, holy cow, I got into University of Pennsylvania. This is amazing. And what was University of Pennsylvania like? What was it like being at a top tier undergraduate college?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly was happy when I got in because there's nobody who's a sure into a college like that. Sometimes even the best kids who are valedictorians and who have 1600s on their SATs don't get in because they're looking at more than just numbers. So yeah, I was very happy. It was my first choice. I ended up applying early decision. So I found out on December 13th of my senior year of high school, which I think that was 1990. That was a long time ago. And so, yeah, I was really excited. I had visited UPenn for a few weekends in my junior year. I had a family friend that went there, and, he showed me around, and I had a great time. And it was definitely my first choice. So I was excited, definitely.
So now you were obviously pre-med. You wanted to go to medical school, University of Pennsylvania, which is a top tier school. Can you tell us a little bit about your application process to medical school and specifically when you first found out about osteopathic school?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I did well at University of Pennsylvania. I had a 3.5 GPA. I didn't think that it was going to be difficult to get into medical school. And maybe I was naive or I didn't really have good guidance, but I figured I would send out my applications and do some interviews and get in somewhere. It didn't go exactly as I had anticipated. I definitely got a few interviews, but certainly more of a few and not a majority of the places that I applied. As counselors tell us to apply to a range of schools, I definitely applied to some foreign medical schools, and I applied to two osteopathic schools in NYITCOM and PCOM in Philadelphia. I learned about osteopathic school from my father. So he had dealt with various DOs in his practice of pharmacy, and he was friends with a few of them. And during college, I ended up spending a few days with one of his friends who was a family practice DO. And I saw that, to me, it looked no different than the MD offices that I had been to as a youngster or a collegiate. So I put in the application, really not knowing fully well what the difference was between osteopathic school and allopathic school. And then when I didn't get into the couple of places that I interviewed that were the US based allopathic schools, I ended up just getting into the osteopathic schools and two of the foreign schools in Israel and in Granada. So at that time, I read up on each of these places and I decided that I was going to go to NYICOM. And I'm happy that I did go there. I had a great education there.
That's awesome. That's a great story. You went to NYICOM. How did you find the medical school? What did you think of the medical school? And specifically, coming out of a top tier undergraduate school like University of Pennsylvania, did you think it was going to be less challenging? Was it what you expected it was going to be?
I don't remember the details of that, but if I were to guess, I would have imagined that I went in the first week or two a little bit arrogant, thinking that I was one of their better applicants. And it probably didn't take me too long to realize that I was there amongst a sea of excellent, very smart, and motivated individuals. So after just a short amount of time, I believed that I belonged there and was very impressed with the people in my class. There were plenty of people who were a little bit older because I came right from college. So there was one guy who was a chiropractor in a previous life. I think there was another student who was an EMT. Those patients who had experienced life in another field, and they knew that they didn't want to do that. They had experienced it, and now they were coming to NYICOM. I felt like they were the most motivated. They had seen what the real world was like, and they knew that they didn't like their initial choice. So they seemed to be the most motivated group. But I felt like we had a great class of really smart students, and I felt like we had a lot of people who studied a lot and who had very high aptitude. And I don't remember exactly how I felt when I got there, but I can say that after a very short period of time, I felt at home there and felt that the students there were very smart, capable students.
All right, Adam. So then you're at NYICOM. You're working hard, obviously. We've spoken to multiple people that have gone to NYICOM, and they've talked about how rigorous and difficult the first few years are. Do you remember when you decided that you wanted to do internal medicine, and how was your application process to residency, specifically as a DO?
So it kind of went in a zigzag fashion for me because I can't say that I decided early on that I wanted to go into internal medicine. I think with each specialty that I did a rotation in, for most of them, I really liked it and thought about considering whichever rotation I was doing, I considered that as a possibility. So I think there was a time in the fourth year where I really hadn't made a decision yet, and I really thought that I was going to go into radiology. I thought that that is what I liked the most, and I did a sub internship in radiology radiology at a local hospital here in Long Island, and I really liked it. My father convinced me that I shouldn't be a radiologist.
Right.
He said radiologists weren't real doctors, and that what happens if I didn't like sitting in a dark room all day? Because one of the aspects of radiology that I really liked was interventional radiology. I had spent a lot of time in my sub-internship with the interventional radiologists, and one of the things is sometimes it's hard to differentiate when you're doing a rotation as a student, whether you really like that field of medicine, whether you just like the people that you're working with. And sometimes it's a really fine line. So I knew I liked interventional. I knew I liked the people that I was doing it with, but not everybody who applies for interventional gets that. And my father had a good point, which was, would you be happy being a general radiologist or somebody in a reading room all day? He did have a good point there, because that wasn't what I wanted at that time. So I was offered a spot in radiology outside of the match, and I had to tell the program whether I was going to take it or not. And it just happened to be that while I had to make that decision, I was doing my sub internship in internal medicine. And it just so happened that I really liked internal medicine, and I had a great team that I was working with, and I enjoyed the variety of the cases. And this was at North Shore University Hospital in Manhasset, where I ended up doing an internal medicine residency. So I ended up at some point deciding that I liked internal medicine, and I liked the options that it gave me in being able to choose different specialties if I wanted to at some point, whereas I felt that radiology gave me those same options, but I just felt that I didn't want to be a radiologist sitting in a reading room all day. It just wasn't for me. I like dealing with people more. So I ended up thanking the chairman of radiology at that institution and thanking them and telling them that I was going to go the way of internal medicine. And that's really the way I decided that I wanted to go into internal medicine.
So that's a great story. I think, in a recent episode, I kind of beat up the radiologist too and said that that's a specialty that I wouldn't have done. There are definitely people that love radiology. There's people that don't want to talk to patients, like a non-patient care specialty. They just want to sit in a dark room, read films, make academic additions to the patient's case, and not have direct patient care. But I agree with you. I think that if that's not your personality, radiology is probably not for you. And I think the other point that you make that students really should listen to, and I think it's very deep, is, you could look 7 years down the road and say, I want to do this sub specialty. But as you said, that's really setting yourself up for a fall if that specific area doesn't work out and you're unhappy with the general specialty that you're going to spend, example of radiology, 5 years training for. So I think that's great advice.
The way that I actually first got interested in imaging and radiology was during my surgical rotation third year. And it's a funny story where the head surgeon who was leading the group asked everyone in our surgery rotation, which was, I think, around 15 students, who wanted to go into surgery and who had no interest in surgery. And so I raised my hand wide saying, oh, I wanted to go into surgery. And I was like jumping up and down. They made two different groups. One was the cutthroat, I want to go into surgery, you got to prove yourself group. And the other one was for the pediatricians or the people who had no interest in going into surgery. And so day one of surgery, I'm gung-ho wanting to be a surgeon. So they said that they had a big case the next day of doing a AAA repair and who wanted to scrub in for this. So I'm jumping up saying, me. So they decide to give me the case and they tell me to spend the night reading about the anatomy, that they were going to test me and to learn about the surgery and to be at the hospital at 4:30 in the morning. So I was very excited. I probably didn't sleep the whole night, and I ended up scrubbing in for my first surgery. And I'll tell you, after that experience, I knew I didn't want to be a surgeon because while I was scrubbed in, I was retracting for 4 hours. I thought my arms were going to fall off. I hadn't eaten breakfast. I was about to pass out. I was holding in, probably having to urinate. And I just knew that standing under those hot lights with all of those feelings, it just wasn't for me. I couldn't do that. And now I had another 3 months to do a rotation, yet I knew there was no chance I was going to go into surgery. So I ended up hanging out with the radiologist. I was just looking for something that I was going to be passionate about and looking for something there where I could spend my time there so that it wasn't a waste. And we used to go over the imaging of the patients that we were seeing each day before rounds. I noticed that they weren't really, the residents, the surgical residents weren't very good at it. So, because we would ask them questions and they wouldn't be able to answer us. So I ended up spending a lot of time in the reading room with the radiologists who didn't have students and were very eager to teach. And they showed me all of our CAT scans and sonograms, and I was able to present that part of rounds. So I was still able to contribute to the surgical rounds, but I didn't really scrub into too many more surgeries after that. And I think once I spent that time in radiology and I had all of these attendings and residents, looking to me for the answers when it came to radiology, it was kind of exciting. So I thought that that might be something that liked imaging, at least for a period of time.
So I'm going to fast forward. So you went to North Shore for your residency. Your residency was difficult and trying and a lot of issues during residency, but I really want to focus a little bit on when you were graduating and how you chose a job and how you decided what you wanted to do. So can you talk to us about that a little bit?
Sure. I think it really goes back probably 2 years from graduation where I actually thought that I wanted to go into gastroenterology. I liked gastroenterology and I actually applied for a gastroenterology fellowship. And it was a different time back then. The internet was in its infancy. And then all of the programs had their own individual applications. And of course, they would all make them light green or pink, and you had to type with an old traditional typewriter onto these. We would go to work all day and then come home, type these applications. And I think one of the things that the modern day student should appreciate are all these common applications where you get to just type everything once and lots of schools or programs get to use it. We had to do it the old fashioned way and it wasn't fun, especially when you made an error and you were trying to correct it with a light green color or pink. It was just very difficult. But I thought that I wanted to go into gastro. I had done some research, no major publications, but I didn't end up getting it after the interviews that I had. During that interview process, I think I interviewed at 6 or 7 different programs, really in places all over the country. I was in Texas, I was in Baltimore. It just didn't happen. Those programs usually take, I think, between 1 and 2 GI fellows a year, and it's so ultra competitive. And I didn't get it. Other people who didn't get their fellowships, who really wanted to do that specialty of medicine, figured out a way once they didn't get it. They found a way to get it, whatever that was, whether it was working in a lab instead of going on vacation, whatever their method was. But for me, I guess I didn't love it enough. It wasn't as important to me to continue pursuing it, which I think is probably different than a lot of the people that you've had on the podcast, because a lot of people that I've heard from this podcast, when they've had difficulty, they kept pressing on, and it was very impressive to hear that. And it wasn't that I didn't have that fortitude, but it was that I actually liked internal medicine. I was in the primary care program of our internal medicine residency, which meant that I spent more time in the clinic or the outpatient sector than most of the regular categorical residents. And I really did enjoy that. And I was able to potentially see that as something that I could do long term. And that's where it was. So when I didn't get into GI and I decided that I didn't want to continue fighting for that, and I was happy to do outpatient general internal medicine. And that's the direction that I went.
So, Adam, I totally agree. I think that's a great story. And I think that's part of the reason why I wanted to have you on the podcast. I think your story illustrates that the path isn't always linear. And sometimes through your experience, you figure out, and this is the second time that you're telling me that you got some advice or you saw a different way or you took a step back and looked at things a little differently and reassessed your direction and then went forward, which I think is super important. The other reason that I really thought it was important to have you on the podcast is that you've actually been through every permutation of internal medicine. So, can you bring us on your journey briefly from finishing residency, your first job, to getting to where you are today?
Certainly. So, right out of residency, I joined a practice, an outpatient, or I wasn't outpatient, but a private practice in the Long Island area. It was supposed to be the lead physician who owned it, an associate, and I was coming in as the third physician. It didn't happen that way. And when I ended up reporting for the first day, I had seen that the associate had left. And that was a little funny, and no one really wanted to talk about it. But I ended up working for this gentleman for probably around 6 months. And I think when we take a job, or certainly when I took this job, I had the anticipation of thinking that this was going to be the one and only job that I had, and picked its location based on where I wanted to live, and amongst other parts of what was being offered. But we always, or at least I always, looked at this in a long-term way. But after practicing medicine in that community, and particularly with that physician, I knew that that wasn't the right practice for me in the long term. So I ended up giving them my letter of resignation, and I did that once I had already secured another position. And I had secured a position at North Shore University Hospital in Manhasset, where I had done my residency as a hospitalist. I took the job not necessarily because I wanted to be a hospitalist long term, but I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do long term. My first job didn't end up working out the way I had wanted to, for a multitude of reasons: personalities, locations, things like that.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. For our listeners, can you just explain to us what a hospitalist is and what that job is like?
Sure. There are, I think, lots of different variations of what a hospitalist is, but really what it is it's a primary care doctor, like an internist. I'm sure a family practice doctor can do the same thing, but your entire job rests in the hospital. You take care of hospitalized patients only. So I would admit patients, I would see them through their care. Sometimes in my job as a hospitalist, I would also help out with other emergencies, and on the floors, help the nurses out, and help the residents out in the middle of the night if I was working a night shift. But essentially, it's just someone whose entire practice rests within the walls of the hospital. You don't have an office outside of the hospital.
Okay, so you did this hospitalist job and you were really thinking that this was going to be a short term. At what point did you decide that you wanted to go back into practice, and then what happened?
So I did it for about 3 years, and there were a lot of great things about being a hospitalist, and there were some things that I didn't think were great. One of the things that was great was that you did your shift, and when you left the hospital, you weren't getting paged. Your time off was your own time. It wasn't infringed upon in any way from emergency calls or anything like that. And that's a big departure from what I've been through over the last probably 15 years. So I see that as a real benefit. But I did see when I was a hospitalist that it wasn't really exactly what I wanted to do. I preferred more the outpatient setting. So eventually, once I figured that out, I looked for opportunities that were more congruous with that.
So you finished that hospitalist time and then you decided you wanted to go back into practice again. Is that what happened?
Through being a hospitalist, I knew that I didn't want to spend my entire career in the walls of a hospital. It just wasn't for me. So my first job working for somebody else, the one thing that I did like about it was practicing medicine. The things that I didn't like about it were extraneous aspects, more of the people I was working with, in the type of office that it was. It wasn't the practice of medicine. So after having both of those experiences, I realized that I liked a combination of both, seeing some patients in the hospital, but having a more heavily weighted outpatient practice. At that time, I looked for opportunities that kind of match that. One of those opportunities came up, and that was working with a woman who had been in practice with somebody else who was transforming his practice into a concierge medicine practice. So he was leaving, working with her, and they had worked together for 20 years. So there was an opening for another physician working with her. And after looking at the opportunity, I took it. And it wasn't joining this woman's practice. It was basically working in the same location, kind of having two separate practices, but sharing the costs of employees, rent, and things like that. But we had our own practices. That worked out well for a while, but eventually I ended up decided to break off on my own and just have my own complete private practice, not affiliated with any other physicians. One thing that I learned after my experiences, my first three experiences, were that you have to really take the personalities of other physicians into account when you're working with them, whether it's as their employee or whether it's sharing office space, because it becomes a huge factor. In my case, eventually I became miserable having to deal with someone else who didn't meet my expectations in a lot of ways. So when that happened, I ended up deciding I just want to go into practice by myself. I don't have to deal with any other personalities. It ended up being the best thing for me. But just for the viewers out there, particularly students, the one thing I would say is I would really do your research in spending time, as much time as you can, with people that you're considering going into practice with. Another aspect of that I think is really important to try to gauge is how willing is a physician that you're going to join? How willing are they to share their practice with you? What I mean by that is a lot of times doctors talk about making an associate a partner after a certain amount of years. What I've seen, not only in my case, but particularly in looking at my friends and my co-residents and what they've been through over the last 20 years, is that doctors who build their own practice on their own with their blood, sweat, and tears are not so quick to give any piece of that to somebody else. And they might say that, and they might actually honestly believe that they're willing to share their practice over some time. But I think it's a lot of lip service. And I think that you really have to gauge from talking to people. If you're thinking of joining a practice and being there long term, and they're talking about a partnership somewhere down the line, I think you really have to gauge how serious somebody is at making you a partner, and maybe even in the beginning trying to understand what that route would look like. Because I see where people say they'll do this, but at the end of the day, they have a hard time making people partners. And I understand it, because I had to build my own practice, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, on my own. And when you do that, it takes a lot of time, effort. There's a learning curve. And some people aren't willing to go through that and then make an easier road for somebody else. So I just want to highlight that, particularly for the students, because maybe that will save you, some of the heartache that I've gone through and that a lot of my co-residents have gone through over the years.
I think everybody should really listen to that advice closely. I think that's amazing advice and very important. And I think a lot of our listeners are, maybe in residency thinking about a practice, and maybe they should go back and listen to that section about 20 more times and just, let it marinate. But on the other side, the thing that I would ask you, or maybe the thing that you're being modest about, is when you started your own practice, you went to University of Pennsylvania. Did you take business classes? Were you prepared for the business of medicine? Was that a huge burden? And was that very difficult to learn and take a lot of your time?
Yes. I mean, yes, it was a big burden. It took a lot of my time, not that I was ready for it. So I didn't take any business classes at University of Pennsylvania, despite the fact that most of my friends were in the Wharton School of Business. I did gain some modest amount of understanding of the stock market and trading futures from listening to them study for tests, but it wasn't something that I was ever really interested in at that time. I'm probably more interested in it now than I certainly was at any other point in my life. So yeah, you learn, there's no book on how to open up a private practice. I almost think it would be an unbelievable, valuable thing to write. But what happens is that book would change very frequently because as medicine changes and as policy changes, then how to open up a practice successfully would change. But it took a lot of seeing patients and not getting paid for it, whether it was billing errors or using the wrong billing companies, things of that nature, and not knowing how to negotiate leases. And you learn every part of it. It's not easy, but I think it's worth it for somebody who wants to work for themselves and is willing to put in the time. But I'll tell you that in probably the first 6 or 7 years that I was in private practice, going both seeing patients in the hospital and seeing patients in the private office and doing it completely by myself, I never went on vacation and never had a day off. It was 24/7, 365. And if someone needed to be admitted at any one of the three hospitals that I went to, I got the call, and it didn't matter what I was doing. If I was at the movies, if I was out to dinner, if I was sleeping, it was me. So it took a lot of time and a lot of effort. I always thought that every time I went on a treadmill, my beeper went off. So I would go to the gym in the morning and get ready to start trying to be healthy and exercise. And as soon as I was on the treadmill for 2 minutes, my phone would go off, or back in the old days, the beeper, and I'd have to go to the hospital and see someone before the day started. So it just takes a lot of time and effort, but it doesn't mean that it's not worth it.
Okay, that's awesome. Again, another section that I think some of the listeners should go back and listen to about another 20 times. My next question is, I know at some point you mentioned that you hired a physician extender. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about the pros and cons of having a PA. And then ultimately, I know in the last few years, you joined a healthcare system. So maybe you could talk to us a little bit about why you made that decision.
Sure. So, yeah, eventually it gets tough to be, doing everything for a business yourself. Whether at that time I was going to three hospitals, rounding in three hospitals in the morning by myself. I was seeing patients throughout the day and then having to usually admit one or two people at the end of the day and then get lots of calls, because when you have patients admitted to the hospital and you're the attending of record, you're going to get lots of phone calls. There's no way around that. So after doing that for around 7 years, I decided that it really impeded on my personal life, on the time that I was able to spend with my wife and son. I wanted to make some changes so that I could be more available, more around for my family, go on vacation, things like that. So I thought about different options, and what I thought was the best option for me was to hire a physician extender. I ended up getting a physician assistant, but I thought about hiring another physician. I thought about hiring a nurse practitioner, and it just so happened that I knew a physician assistant who was very excellent and very independent, and that's what I was looking for. And that was very helpful for me. It took some of the pressure off. It let me have a day off during the week to be with my family. It helped me to be off every other weekend, and it made a difference. It was really helpful in getting my life back and getting some quality of life and being able to go on vacation and the like. So it was an important thing, but you have to have enough patience, and I don't mean patience, I mean having the right number of patients to be able to support that, because that's a big salary and there's a lot of other costs that come with having another employee that makes a high salary. There's health insurance, which is very expensive, malpractice insurance, and other incidentals. So it was a big investment, but it was definitely worth it. And my PA stayed with me for 7 years before we ended up joining a big healthcare system about a year and a half ago. Yeah, I think almost every 7 years for me, I was looking for a change or a way to improve the quality of my life. And even when I had the physician assistant, I still was doing a lot of running a business and dealing with a landlord and dealing with changes in health insurance and buying health insurance for the office. And, I wanted to spend that time more with being a doctor and not being a business owner. And so I think that was really a big piece of why I decided to join a big healthcare system where now I get to just be a doctor. I've experienced so many facets of internal medicine or being a physician, and I had enough of the ones that I've done before. So it was just time to have someone else who had better expertise to deal with the business of the practice. And I just wanted to be a doctor. And I guess in just today's healthcare environment, for me, that's the right decision. I didn't feel like for me, it was worth it to spend that extra time running a business. And I'm very happy with that decision sitting here right now. I have a tremendous amount of support that I've never had in my life. I've always had to do everything on my own. And being an employee of a big hospital system, I always have people to reach out to help me with any problems that come along. And with just having experienced COVID-19, I was very happy to not be in private practice and to have the support of my healthcare system. So it was the right decision for me at that time, and who knows what the future holds. I hope that I stay here for the next 20 years, and then that's the end of my career. But you never know. As you could see, there have been many changes along the way, and I picked what I thought was right for me. But either way, at the end of the day, I enjoy being a general internal medicine. I've had a great education. I've met unbelievable people along the way. And besides for being a rock star, a drummer for Metallica, or being a race car driver for Formula One, which are both fairly unrealistic things, I couldn't think of anything else I'd rather do every day than be an internist and be a physician. So I feel very privileged to wake up every day to do that.
Adam, first of all, I just want to say thank you again for doing this interview with us. To me, your story is a quintessential physician's journey, which took twists and turns, and some of the points sounded like they were a little difficult, but ultimately you were successful in everything that you did and are happy in your current position. I don't think you could give us a better story. One more question, if you don't mind. I always ask people when they come on our podcast, specifically, if they remember, and let me just say, you've given all of our listeners plenty of good advice coming directly from you. But I would ask, is there any piece of advice or a few pieces of advice that you've been given from mentors, from teachers, from attendings, from your parents even, over the years that you think would be valuable to our listeners that you would like to pass on?
Sure. I think, I've received a lot of encouragement and a lot of very useful advice from lots of people. And I think the most important thing is one of the most simple pieces of advice that someone ever gave me. And I forget who it was, and I'm sorry, but they would always tell me, and it's such a cliche thing, but do what you love. I see that if you do what you love, the rest kind of comes. I see a lot of medical students, whether it's an allopathic or osteopathic medical students, picking out or trying to pick a specialty that they think is going to match the salary requirements that they think that they might have. And they pick things not based on their enjoyment and love and interest in it. And when you do that, you may end up being happy, but you can also have a big disappointment. And, it's really difficult to go back and do training. Most hospitals won't allow it for various reasons. So you have to pick wisely and pick what you love and what you're passionate about. And if you do that, you'll be happy with the rest of your life, no matter what your salary is.
Adam, again, thank you so much for being with us today. This was very valuable.
Thanks for having me, and good luck with the podcast. I'm going to keep listening. I appreciate all the time and effort that you guys put into it.
This concludes our episode of Do or Do Not. Send all inquiries, comments, suggestions, and even let us know if there's someone you want us to interview to doordonotpodcast@gmail.com. Don't forget to like us on Facebook at Do or Do Not Podcast for updates. If you enjoyed our podcast, please share it with your classmates and administration. We have plenty of more interviews lined up, and we're excited to share them with you. This is Tian Yu Shea. Thank you guys so much for listening to Do